Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to get going. So, Fáilte roimh gach duine. Yeah, very pleased and excited to be organizing this event. I appreciate people coming out tonight. We're competing with canvassing happening all across the country at this stage in every single constituency and currently happening around the corner as well. So it's hey, how's it going? It's been really good to see people come out to this to focus on the topic of housing and tenancy rights as part of the Catherine Connolly campaign. So I'm just going to give a very brief intro. So my name is Aaron Downey. I am involved in the Connolly campaign and the Tenants and Housing Campaigners for Connolly Affinity Group. And I suppose I'll just give like a tiny bit of context before introducing our speakers. So I think in the first instance, it's quite interesting that this has become a topic of the campaign at all. So generally, we think of presidential elections as, quite abstract, high-level affairs that don't deal much with sort of the bread and butter issues that affect people across this country, that are more the purview of, government policy and things like this. But I think there's been a very strong emphasis from the start of this campaign from Catherine about reaching people where they're at and talking about what's directly affecting people at the moment. From talking about her own background growing up in social housing in Salthill, in Shantala in Galway, up to her comments that she has made repeatedly on podcasts and on news media talking about the neoliberalization of our housing policy. And maybe some of our speakers later can talk a little bit about what that means. But, looking at how over time councils have successively built less housing stock, how they've been underfunded by successive governments, and how that has led to the depths of the housing crisis that we have today, and left a vacuum for hatred and division in our society. And I think she's been very strong on this across the board. I also think that it's interesting and a sort of bittersweet irony that Fianna Fáil presidential hopeful Jim Gavin was forced to pull out of the race due to a dispute involving unpaid rent or unrepaid rent to a tenant who had overpaid during the financial crash, and that this was a really big scandal that had caused him to totally withdraw from campaigning. So I think in some sense that also put housing on the agenda of a presidential election in a way that we wouldn't otherwise expect. And I suppose lastly, I think that this opens up space for a wider conversation on the issue in the context of this election and moving beyond it. So like part of what I wanted us to discuss here today is how do we build a movement beyond just what happens on October 24th after the votes are counted and, if we get Connolly elected to the Áras. So I think Michael D. Higgins has pushed out the boat on this in his term in some sense in calling the housing crisis a disaster and directly commenting on this and holding up the current government to scrutiny on the issue. But I also wanted to talk about how this can act as a galvanizing moment for a different housing system. So how do we use this momentous campaign that we have built, this opportunity to elect, a radical alternative to Áras an Uachtaráin to build beyond just the term of the presidency and build an actual alternative that can directly challenge housing policy both on the ground and in politics in the years to come. So I'm really excited with the cast of speakers that we have here tonight. So Owen O'Brien will be joining us a bit later. He's on his way from the Dáil. But beside me, I have Bernard Joyce, a traveller activist, and I have Roisin Kaneda, who is involved in housing campaigning in the Gaeltacht, and Jenny Maguire, who's involved in housing campaigning for students, I suppose. So, Bernard, I know you arrived late, but I was going to ask you to speak first, if that's okay with yourself. Okay. So, take it away.
I am prepared, I have to say. So, thank you so much. Okay, just a bit awkward, isn't it? Here we are. There we are. We're all good. We're all good. Anyway, thought it was a nice evening, and apologies, a little bit late, but I was running from our office is just on the quays. But I'm here tonight, and just thanks so much for the invitation. And I do feel quite humble to be in, I suppose, in a space like this with so many great activists and parliamentaries and elected representatives. So thank you for that. So I just want to kind of start off just saying I feel quite honoured and humbled to speak before everybody today, and as part of Catherine Connolly's presidential of the campaign in Mali, speaking on the issues, I suppose, that touches many of us across the corner of our society. So I think what's really important is when we're looking at the meaning of a home. I'll just wait for Owen to sit down. I'll take a pause.
Good to see you.
Get in here, Owen. You're probably going to miss the most important part. But what's really key is, like, what do we mean when we describe a home? And I know there's a conversation about housing and about accommodation, but what's really important is what do we mean when we're talking about a home? And a home is not just a structure, but it's actually a place. It's where we can, I suppose, in some ways, where we can, laugh, where we can cry, where we have dreams, where we can build, where we're, and it's very much for our community. It's actually the heartbeat of who we are, and part of that is part of our lives. So we're connecting, where it's a place where many people will have their, I suppose, close to their education. It will be part of where they go to work. It will be part of who you are in communities. Everybody talks about community, and I think, this area has a long history of community, and very central to Dublin. So it's part of your identity. And it's to have a home, it's to have a place in the world as well. So it's really important. I suppose when I was looking at that, it was kind of like, this is really important in the context of not just bricks and mortar. It's not just about housing and about value, but it's a lot more. So in Ireland today, I think we are in the midst of a crisis. I don't think I have to restate that, but it certainly goes beyond, the supply and demand. But it's a crisis, really, in terms of value, and it's a value in what we see. So in terms of profits, in terms of prioritising over people, in some cases, we're talking about a wider scheme here. We're talking about vacant properties. We're talking about numbers of what's available and where families are being forced to live in emergency accommodation. And I think we all kind of must ask ourselves, what actually type of society do we want? So what type of society do we want, and what do we want to build? And it's not just about bricks and mortar. And I can tell you that because, like, when it comes to travel accommodations, it's not about the bricks, it's not about the stones, it's actually about its people. And I have a lot to say about that. Just in terms of dignity, just in terms of having a place to live, just in terms of quality, and housing should not be a privilege. And I know more times than not, it does become a privilege. And and you hear people boasting about their homes and values and costs. And it certainly is. There is a home for people in Ireland, but there's a home for those who can afford it. And I see that very much. I'm Kells, County Meath, and I can see properties of 440,000, 450. So it is for people who can afford, and you do need to have significant income. But you also have to kind of look at it, in terms of, like, it's not about profiteering or about privilege, it's about equality. And when I just talk a little bit about belonging, and I think communities strive when people are rooted very much. And some of this is, you can also see that, there's a displacement of people, particularly for the travel community as well, when you talk about displacement. People are starting to find themselves without the connections, without their roots, without family supports, without the people that they would normally have around them, and that becomes a disconnect, and it becomes a challenge, and it comes to, some cases, a displacement, because families who otherwise would have had everybody around them actually don't have the same support, same networks, and in fact, in some cases, for our community and for other communities, it becomes a sense of, people very much trying to further, in terms of further exclusion, and that brings its own challenges. So just in terms of what, I have some figures here, but just in terms of what we must do, and I know there'll be some other speakers in terms of policy, some of the particular initiatives and bold action that's required in terms of putting people first. So there has to be investment, there has to be protection, there has to be empowering local communities, there has to be reclaiming homes, and for what purpose and what need. It is in terms of ensuring that generations who are watching the crisis unfold, that they're not left behind, and that people do need to step up, in terms of stepping up and speaking out and rebuilding and meaningful homes for everyone, and enshrined in terms of law. That has to be legislative, and then for the traveller community, the impact is compound. So I'm saying this in the context of the broader housing, so do bear with me. But in terms of the broader housing, it's not just housing, but it's accommodation. So for travellers in Ireland, it's far greater and it's far more deeply rooted. So it's about the very denial of our culture, our way of life. It's about our identity. It's about our very existence as people on this island. And being a traveller today is an act of resistance. It's like people speaking Irish during British rule. A refuse, and I suppose for us, it's this refusal to assimilate, to be part of something that we don't want to be part of, and it's a declaration of who we are as a people. So we should never be asked or expected to abandon our traditions, our values, our heritage, just to fit into a system that was never built for us and that we struggle with every day. So what I was trying to highlight there is that there is a system in place, but we weren't part of it. We didn't manufacture it, we didn't engineer it, we weren't part of decisions. It was never fit for our community, nor has it ever been fit for certain other communities as well. And I could probably say that in terms of other communities, in terms of being further excluded from decision making. So when we look at that, we're being asked to give way to, to the mainstream culture and way of life, but at a cost of our own identity, at a cost of who we are as a people. And that's very evident in terms of the policies that are being designed, and policies that are being designed, but they're not designed to include us, but more or less to assimilate us, more or less to silence, to erase. And and if I can say this, and say it very clearly, it's a symptom of institutionalized racism. So if you can look at all the depth and all the issues, but when you look at the system, it is actually to erase diversity, is to raise our culture and a system that constantly disadvantage travellers through neglect, through exclusion, through denial of rights and institutional racism. And it's not just about overt discrimination. So when you look at that, it's where are those decisions being made, and where are those decisions being made now? So they are being made, but they're made behind closed doors. Yep. It's also been made in the terms of what's not been said. So it's been made in terms of funding never arriving. So we don't see the funding arriving. So the policies kind of never get implemented. So they're said, but they're not fully carried out. And that then when we look at that and then we look around the tables, we're actually not at the table. So it's about being treated as a problem to be managed rather than a people to be respected. I don't know if you all agree with me on that, but from my experience, we've always been seen as a community to be managed, a community to be, to resolved in terms of issues, but rather than people to be respected. So I've literally spent a lifetime, I would say that, pretty much a lifetime, campaigning, advocating, and working. And the people who tend to listen is actually a minority within a minority. You don't tend to get, the respect or the invitations to particular spaces to actually air these issues. So it's really, we're kind of campaigning for change, and that change is slow. It can happen, but it also has to have a movement to make that change happen. So it's not just kind of the political issue; it's a human issue, and that's why we appreciate the work of all parties across the political spectrum, because it shouldn't be a political issue. It's a human issue. It's about dignity. It's about justice. And it's about justice for our people on this island. And travel accommodation has been long neglected for decades, long before the housing crisis. So when people talk about the housing crisis, absolutely, I agree completely that it's unacceptable, and some of the notes here reference to that. But you can also see that despite councillors' reports, national, European, international human rights bodies highlighting the substandard living conditions, and the political will to act has been absent. The denial of culturally appropriate housing, the denial of identity, the denial of rights. And many travellers live in some of the harshest conditions in Europe. The lack of delivery, the implementation, the lack of accountability, the curtailed in their quality of life, the ability to strive. So the travelling community is less than 1% of the population. Some cases, some people would know that. So we're really half of Croke Park would fill, you get the whole traveller population. And then you look at that and you break that down in terms of who's eligible for houses, it's even less than that. So the stats are really harsh for when it comes to the travelling community. Some like 58% of travellers are under the age of 25. And I'm just wondering, like, anybody, just in terms of anybody over 39, can you just stand up for a second? Just over 39.
I have to reveal my age.
Yeah.
If you're able to.
Now, over 39. Over 39.
I'm way over 39.
So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, out of no, hold it. So I want 5. There's 10 people. 5 people to sit down. Okay. So for the people who are standing in our community, you will get past the age of 39. For the people who dropped down, you will not have reached that age. That is the stark reality. So you can all sit down, but this is what I'm trying to show you really is that half of our population will not reach the age of 39. So that's 53,000, 21,500 of our community will not get that age. So in our community, we don't talk about pensions. We don't talk about, getting older, because we don't talk about those conversations, and so in some ways, though, for those communities, we demand now adequate provision of accommodation, because we cannot afford, and those provisions of accommodation can be a life changer for people, and I just think that's worth noting. And within that, unemployment stands at 61%, and it was 82 before the last consensus. But when you look at that, why is that not a crisis? Like, why isn't people not standing up, marching, demonstrating with us? It's not happening. So, like, our lives in this island matter less. It matters less because it's not as important. And I was asked, and thanks very much, and I'll come to the final point, was a movement. I'm part of a movement. I believe you cannot move without actually bringing people with you. I believe a movement is about unity. It's about collective action. It's about travellers. It's about duty bearers who are not travellers holding responsibility and taking responsibility and working with us. It's based in grassroots. It's based in these community centres across the country. It's based in communities where, where we can work together, solidarity, respect, and shared vision. So we can demand we must demand leadership that doesn't just speak, but listens, understands, acts, and leadership that brings people together. So it's really kind of more than just words. And it's not about division. It's not about one community pitched towards another community. And I absolutely contest the idea that somehow there's, that other communities and other needs supersede the needs of people. I think there's plenty that can be done in ensuring that we're not competing. Traveller accommodation does not compete against housing. Accommodation for older people does not compete against younger families. And a person who's looking for a single unit of accommodation does not compete against a family accommodation. So all of these needs are factored in, and that's really important. So finally, I think if it is about presidential elections, I think we do need champions. I do think we do need inclusion. And I do think not just words, but deeds, and someone who will stand with those who have been excluded and work to ensure that every person, regardless of background, has access to safe, adequate, culturally appropriate accommodation on the island and share that provision. On that note, I'm going to conclude. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bernard. That was fantastic, and I think really set the scene around the right to housing, but for everyone in a way that's just and culturally appropriate. I'm going to pass it over to Roisin next, who's going to talk about a little bit of the context around the situation regarding housing in the Gaeltacht in particular, which I think also touches on many of Catherine's sort of her background and also, the Irish language politics of the campaign as well.
Absolutely. Gurmeen Machwiv, firstly, I have to apologise. I was writing my notes on the train from Galway and the customer service office in Houston Station told me they didn't have a printer, so I'll be reading some notes off my phone, which I hate doing. But Dave Massa a chuirde, mar dúirt, mar dúirt Ribishaw is privileged dumsa bheithin so chuma, bhór golúder nacht le bheith caint ní huáin mar jaul ngéirchéim tíochta sa Gaeltacht ach a hochtaí is a há sé dúine votáil son Catherine Connolly. My name is Roisin Canada, and I'm absolutely privileged to be here with you tonight talking a little bit about the Gaeltacht housing context and why it's so important for us to be voting for Catherine Connolly. To explain a little bit about my background in the housing sphere, I'm the advocacy manager with Connolly. So I deal with a lot of our language rights campaigns in the 26 counties, including all of our Gaeltacht campaigns. I was involved in establishing Tintáin, which is a national Gaeltacht housing campaign, and I'm also a member of CATU in Galway, involved in their Homes Not Holiday Lets campaign, but I'm here in a strictly personal capacity tonight, all opinions my own, etc. Not representing any of those, but speaking from the experience, I suppose, that I've gained in all of those different roles. And one of the things that I wanted to start off with, because I've noticed this a lot in watching the various debates and conversations that have happened so far, and in the few that the Irish language and that the Gaeltacht has been brought up very briefly, it's kind of glossed over, often maybe because the person asking the questions mightn't necessarily have a particular understanding of what the Gaeltacht is or what the Gaeltacht actually means. And I think it's important sometimes for everyone to be reminded of that, because people can tend to think, that they're these gorgeous places out in the west coast of Ireland that are having a lovely time, but they're affected by things like housing, just like the rest of us, and are also, a minority community. So we use the word Gaeltacht to describe areas in Ireland where the Irish language is still the primary language of the community, and where we have still Cainteoir Dúchais, our native speakers. And unfortunately, given 800 years of British occupation, colonisation, and then about a century of neglect from successive governments here, we only have Gaeltacht areas now in 7 counties. mostly along the west coast, Donegal, Mayo, Galway, Kerry, and then in Cork, Waterford and Meath as well. And in those Gaeltacht areas, we only have about 100,000 people living, which is about 2% of the population in the 26 counties. And of that very small Gaeltacht population, only a fifth of those are now daily Irish speakers, a 13% decline since the 2011 census. And obviously, all of us here, I think, are seeing the devastating human impact of the housing crisis and the failures of our housing system nationally. But in the Gaeltacht, the additional complexity of that is that it's not just the people that are being affected, but it's the language too. A system that's forcing people out of the Gaeltacht because it's become practically impossible to build, to rent, or to buy in the Gaeltacht means that, an Gaelan as a viable community language is really under threat. And it's out of that context then that the Tintan campaign came into being around this time last year, actually. It's kind of a coalition of individuals and groups and organisations and all sorts of people from all various Gaeltacht areas all around the country. And though it's only been around in the last year or so, it's kind of building on foundations that were laid by generations of language activists. And something that's been really important to us in the last year or so is working with the likes of CATU and with other housing organisations. Because, again, it comes back to, I think, the point that was made about competing interests, and we're not, we shouldn't have to be competing for adequate housing for any one sector of our community. We're trying to build and be part of a movement that ensures, adequate housing and livable communities for everyone on the island. But the one thing that I wanted to kind of focus on talking about this, because it's relevant all over the country, not just in the Gaeltacht, is the question of short-term lets and Airbnbs, because again, this is something in our work in the last couple of years that's kind of unified housing action along with BDS and other kind of social movements that are going on in Ireland, and that have been very important, I think, in Catherine's campaign too. Our housing system and the current homelessness crisis are a direct result not only of policy choices, but the political and ideological interests which those choices serve. We have a housing system defined by commodification and privatisation, which flies in the face of both the principle of housing as a human right and the concept of community. In the Gaeltacht, we can clearly see the impact of this policy of commodification over community when it comes to Airbnb. What I find not funny but ironic about this is it used to be a punishment to get sent to Connemara, but you're paying dearly for the privilege of it now, because the proliferation of short-term lets and Airbnb is affecting, like I said, everywhere in the country and communities all around the world. But in Ireland, the Gaeltacht has been disproportionately impacted. And we've been kind of monitoring Airbnb in the Gaeltacht in a very DIY and unscientific way over the last couple of years. But just this week, I had a meeting with Murray Cox, who's the founder of Inside Airbnb. They're a project that provides data and advocacy to communities that are impacted by Airbnb. And it was both very enlightening and depressing to get some of that data from him. He compared when they first scraped data from Airbnb back in 2019 to data that they scraped just last month in September. And the results are quite frightening. Between 2019 and 2025, there was an 88% increase in the number of entire homes on Airbnb in the Gaeltacht, which is 40% higher of the national increase of 48%. And Murray also, when he was doing all of his tech wizardry for us, was able to break this down into individual, what are called Limerick, Pleanála, Tanga. So I was mentioning earlier that the Gaeltacht is in, we have 7 Gaeltacht counties. But back in 2012, the Gaeltacht was redefined into specific what are called language planning areas. There are 26 of them. And Murray was able to give us his data for all of these 26 areas. And 1 in 5 of those language planning areas now has more entire homes on Airbnb than occupied properties being rented long-term from private landlords. We also found out that the 5 biggest hosts operating in the Gaeltacht have 217 entire homes between them, which is a useful fact to have, despite how awful it is, to kind of counter that narrative that's often put forward by the Airbnb lobby and by some of our own politicians that, Airbnb is just your auntie trying to earn an extra few bob by renting out the spare room or the shed out the back or whatever. But it's a very well-spun story, I think, and a very commonly held misconception. But in Ireland, 67% of Airbnb listings are entire homes. And in the Gaeltacht, that rises to 81%. And we're told constantly that Airbnb assists tourism, but we're never really asked what the cost is for our communities. So we've been trying to open up this conversation in the general public and in the Gaeltacht communities as well, which is a little bit of an awkward conversation at times. And there's a certain amount of pushback to it. And earlier this summer, to kind of move that conversation along, we erected, under cover of darkness, some homemade road signs around Connemara that were showing the difference between the number of properties that were available to rent on Airbnb and those that were available on Daft. And some of them, so we went from the Ferbica in South Connemara back to Lettermallon. There were 115 houses on Airbnb and only 2 properties on Daft, which actually both happened to be in Unspadale, the same village. Like Indravaughan, tiny little village. In South Connemara, 18 Airbnbs, not a single property to rent. Counted in Illawn, 23 Airbnbs, not one house on Daft. The signs did cause a certain amount of controversy, but they definitely got people talking, which is really what we wanted to get at with this, because Airbnb, very frankly, is killing our Gaeltacht communities. And important to note, the same Airbnb that has over 300 properties listed in illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian West Bank. So not only should we be boycotting Airbnb for the future of our native language communities here, but for the future and the freedom of the Palestinian people too. I'm giving Airbnb a hard time here, and justifiably so, I think, but traditional homes and second homes in the Gaeltacht are actually a huge part of the problem as well. There was research done on the 2022 census around holiday homes and the housing issue in the Gaeltacht that found that there are 5 times more holiday homes in the Gaeltacht as a share of the overall housing stock than there are in the country as a whole. And in 3 of those Limerick or those language planning areas that I mentioned earlier, 40% of the houses are holiday homes. If you look at 2 in particular, Kerry has 2 language planning areas, Kerry here and Kerry Haas, 2 geographically quite small areas on the Dingle Peninsula and the Iveragh Peninsula. Between those 2 areas, they have about 3,000 permanent private dwellings, and of those 3,000, 500 of them are Airbnbs and over 2,000 are unoccupied holiday houses. So you don't need to be any expert in sociolinguistics or languages or really anything to see that, if those patterns of home occupation continue, the Irish language in the Gaeltacht, is under huge threat. And that's why I think it's so important for us to have Catherine as our next Uachtaráin. Not only is it so important that we have a president that really and truly understands the Irish language community in the Gaeltacht, and can advocate for us, as she has done for years in the Dáil and on the Irish Language and the Gaeltacht Committee, but also to give us hope, hope that we can, if we manage to elect Catherine to the Áras, actually make a change, that we can have a better Ireland, that we can have a better future. I met Catherine for the first time within about a week or 2 of me starting this job in the Connolly back in 2022, and she's been an invaluable ally ever since. And I think she really is symbolic of a different Ireland rooted in equality, and her campaign gives me so much hope. I think the latest figure is 14,000 volunteers, many of them who maybe haven't been involved in politics or campaigning before, and I see so many similarities, like I was saying, between that and the Irish language movement or the housing movement, that Catherine or the Irish language are, they're movements that are uniting people kind of across the political spectrum, well, most of the political spectrum maybe. Last month we had a massive demonstration in Dublin for the Irish language. The same day, coincidentally, that Sinn Féin announced that they were backing Catherine for the presidency, which I think tied in very nicely in that we had kind of all of the opposition parties marching with us in Dublin. 25,000 people took to the streets for our native language, and at the same time we kind of had renewed hope, I think, that we would actually manage to get Catherine elected to the Áras with this kind of united movement of people. And yeah, I'll finish on that note. In Macree Istig, I genuinely believe electing Catherine would just give us dóchas in Mishnach, gur féidlin and achar sin a bhaintach, mar phobal atá seasta le chéile in aig an égóra agus na hégóframa agus phobal a cheasan son ceirta déine, ceirta tííochta agus ceirta taga.
Gur míle mágat Roisin. So Jenny, you're going to speak next. Tough act to follow, but I'm sure you'll do a good job. So you're going to talk.
We'll see.
Okay. You're going to talk about your experience in terms of housing organising.
Guramila Rish, and thank you very much to the last few speakers. And I think, like, everyone up here tonight and everyone in the audience and anyone watching at home knows about housing. Everyone is an individual housing expert because it is the thought that consumes our ability to do anything else. It is, whether it is in education, I served as the Trinity SU president for a year last year, and I quickly understood that was the foundation of which everything else grew upon. That it didn't matter if the right supports were in the education system or if people were getting the right stipends or this, that, and the other, because none of the supports were meeting the scale of the emergency that we all know too well. We have seen successive governments not only enable but facilitate this situation. We have seen that successive governments are determined to ensure that the likes of everyone up on this stage, everyone in this room, has a tougher time in getting their housing, because ultimately that is not what's on their agenda. It's on pleasing developers, it's on pleasing international markets, it's on making sure that the few have much more than any of us ever will. And it is that model that our housing system is run, and it is that model that we must oppose at every turn. Whether we're in a presidential election like we're here today, or whether it's the day after the presidential election, because these issues are continuing. And you spoke on it briefly, that like it's come up so much in the campaign, and because it is how we see the world. I mean, the first time I got involved in this campaign was I got the opportunity to interview Catherine for students for Connolly, and I did so in the box room of my childhood bedroom. And so that I think that spoke to something much bigger, that ultimately it is in our box room bedrooms, and it is in the flats that you're sharing with 9 other housemates, or it's in emergency accommodation, or it's in all sorts of situations right across this island that people have been given an opportunity for hope. And I think with all of the parties of the left coming together around a single candidate, it is a hope that I have not seen before. And it is a hope that has really reinvigorated myself to believe that there can be another way. And I think that's what Catherine has really pushed towards. And it is a hope that has not just come out of nowhere. It has come from the likes of Cat2, who have done amazing organising over the past few years. Up where I live, up in Coolock on the north side, there's been some fantastic organising in Cromcastle Courts, the Kilmore Flats as I would call it growing up, where it's, even when you still go past it today, signs litter the railings on the outside talking that we need homes, that we need better conditions, because these are the things that unite us all. There's been a lot of talk around the role of the presidency, and Catherine has rightly pointed out that it's the duty of the president to ensure the welfare of the Irish people. And the idea that this is some sort of threat, I think, speaks volumes. That the idea that someone who speaks for housing, that someone who speaks for people with disabilities, someone who speaks for equality, is somehow a threat to the government, should say it all. And I think for another campaign that is focused on stirring the pot, that's focused on dividing us, I think Connolly has consistently shown us that there is another way, and we have to keep moving beyond this. That after this campaign, on the day after, our fight must still keep going, and it's a fight that we can all have, and it's a fight that we must have. I think this hope is something that cannot dissipate, and I think it is something that people have been crying out for, and I think it is giving people a real confidence. I think when I talk to, whether it's my own family members, people in my community, or during my time as SU president, I was often faced with this wall of people being like, well, surely they're trying their best. And I, like, surely that actually they have exhausted every way in order to make sure everything's running, that this has to be the way. And I think what this campaign is starting to expose is that actually they're full of shite. That there's another direction and another world that can exist. And I think we just had to be brave enough to show it. And we just had to be brave enough to stick our heads up higher when they throw stuff at us. And it is all the stuff that's been thrown at this campaign and all the stuff that's been thrown towards Catherine that speaks to the power that is available to us. Students are going to college and their home base to rest, to cry, to laugh is their car. Students are going to college and their home base is the library. Students are going to college and their home base is on a Monday to Wednesday, they're in this friend's house. And on a Thursday to Friday, they're in this friend's house on their couch. And it must get to a point, and this must be the point that we say, no more. And it is this moment of people gathered in this room and people across the country having these conversations and being excited by this campaign, or if not even just excited, but just seeing that another thing is possible and that another direction is possible and that the left is unified around a single idea. And it is these bread and butter issues that is going to lose Fine Gael this campaign, because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have consistently relied on all of us to feel a sense of hopelessness. I mean, the lack of advertising on the Humphreys campaign towards young people speaks to that. They don't want you to go out and vote. They don't want you to go out and vote because that would be representative of the opinions of the people of Ireland, and they know that they do not represent that. And so we're here tonight to talk about housing, and we're here to talk about hope, and we're here to talk about the courage that people are showing every day and continuously to come out for this campaign. But we must continue to organise thereafter with the likes of Catu. You must talk to your neighbours about these basics, the basic things. Community has been taken away from it. It's a crisis of community as much as it is a crisis of housing, as much as it is a crisis of everything else we've been consistently told. We must talk to each other. We must get off our phones, sweet Jesus. And we must have a conversation face to face, because then we realize that it is our humanity that unites us and it is everything else that is trying to push us apart. And that is why we need Catherine Connolly as our Uachtaráin. That is why we need a president that stands up for the welfare of the Irish people. It's why we need politicians to do so, and it's why we must all continue to demand the basics, and then we can have everything else.
I joked that Roisin would be a tough act to follow, but now I think Owen is the hardest job so far. He has to come after those three. So, Owen O'Brien, TD for Sinn Féin in Dublin Midwest.
Brilliant. So look, first of all, thank you very much, genuinely, for the opportunity to come and speak today. I actually want to talk a bit about Catherine Connolly first, before I talk about housing, because I've been Sinn Féin's housing spokesperson in the Dáil for 10 years. And I have participated in hundreds and hundreds of hours of Dáil debates, literally. Private members' motions, government legislation, leaders' questions. And you can imagine there's a lot of very important contributions, but there's also an awful lot of rubbish that's talked. There's only so many times you can hear a government minister or backbencher defend the indefensible. There's only so many times you can listen to independent rural TDs speak out of both sides of their mouth about housing policy. But in all of those debates, there is one person whose contributions you were always forced to listen to. It's one of the things that, because we're in there all the time and we see and we hear it, we get a sense of it maybe more than the wider public. Catherine Connolly has been a tireless advocate for all communities, who have been experiencing housing stress and housing crisis over the last decade, and I mean all communities. What's striking about her contributions is she's always very thoughtful, she's always very considered. There's no ranting and raving, there's no theatre, there's no putting on a show for the sake of it. She is coming in to advocate for those people who are being let down by bad government housing policy and to set out over and over and over again straightforward solutions to fix the problems. And she does it with a grace. She does it with a composure, which I think makes her an absolutely ideal candidate for president. And I'm not saying that because it's a Catherine Connolly event. It's actually one of the reasons why I, along with colleagues, made a very strong case inside the party that we should absolutely support this campaign 100%. And Bernard and I are old pals, and we've been campaigning for a long time. Roisin, we haven't met, but Tinton is a really important organisation and part of not just a growing, vibrant Irish language movement, but an Irish language movement that isn't just about the language, it's about all of those other facets that make a community. And Jenny and I have met a number of times, but she's a powerful advocate for, in particular in this context, students and the ongoing student crisis. But I'm also taken by the fact that we're in Fatima. Right? And I think this is a really important place for this conversation, because those of you who are from this community and know it better than I do, know that at the epicenter of this community's history, of Fatima, of Rael to Dolphin's Barn and Drimna, or Crumlin North, as it used to be called, across the canal, housing has been at the very centre of these community struggles over a century. This particular area used to be slums. It used to be tenements and some of the worst quality housing. And then because of people like the folks on this audience, campaigners, good politicians, good civil servants, good trade unionists, they campaigned to have the slums demolished and our grandparents or great-grandparents provided with state-of-the-art public housing. We need not to forget, when Fatima Mansions was first built, the quality of those homes for the people who were moving out of the tenements and into them was luxury. And I know that because I've interviewed many of those people in the inner city flat complexes that were built during the 30s and 40s. But the story of Fatima then isn't just about the state doing it right. It's also about the state then doing everything wrong afterwards. Neglect, failure to repair, failure to maintain. Again, a story Bernard and the travelling community know only too well. And therefore, over time, communities that had been given at least the opportunity of quality, affordable homes, then have all of that taken away from them. And again, as folks from here know better than I do, you then have the dispersal of communities, the demolition of homes, the failure of public-private partnership regenerations. And absolutely, Airbnb is such an acute issue in rural communities in the Gaeltacht. But go and talk to people in a neighbourhood like this. Because again, Airbnb short-term lets is squeezing local folks. And when I say local folks, I don't mean people who are necessarily 5 generations from here. I also mean people who've come here to make this a central part of their life and their community, who simply can't afford to live here. I had a conversation with a man down in Ringsend, 5 generations from Raytown, and he was saying because of the lack of affordable public housing in Ringsend, there are names, family names that have been 5 generations in those proud working class communities that are going to disappear. That's a level of history that's been wiped out, which is exactly the same as I think everybody here has spoken. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because whether it's the ongoing failure of the state to invest in the regeneration and development of Dolphin House, Oliver Bond, whether it's the lack of social housing that's going to be in the LDA project in Trees' Gardens, all of these issues are connected. They're connected to a 100-year refusal to ensure travellers have culturally appropriate and adequate accommodation. It's part of that ongoing failure to even recognise there's a housing crisis in Gaeltacht that is compounding the linguistic and community crisis there. And I have to say, in my 10 years as a TD, the student housing crisis has never been worse. It's not just that students are sleeping in their cars. Students are now foregoing their third-level education to go and work in low-paid jobs in their hometowns or neighbourhoods because they can't afford it. And in this community, how long are we waiting to get council homes? 10, 11, 12, 13 years, living in your parents' box bedroom, living in insecure and overpriced HAP accommodation. We're all connected in this way. And while the President cannot fix the housing crisis, that is the responsibility of government and government forced by campaigners, how good would it be to have a President of our country who fully understands that crisis? How valuable would it be to have a President who for a decade, since she has been elected to the Dáil, has spoke week after week for those people who are homeless, particularly the children who are homeless, who has spoken week after week about those people languishing on local authority council waiting lists all across the country. Week after week has advocated for people stuck in insecure, overpriced rental accommodation, or the housing crisis for our ageing population, or travellers, or in the Irish language community. So I think not only is Catherine perfectly suited for the role of President because of her character, her ability, and her composure, but also she understands all of the issues that we're talking about. And I think that's valuable because I have to say, I've been a big fan of Michael D as President because he knew when it was time to stand up. He knew when it was time to stand up and say to the government on housing, on trade, on Gaza, on peace and neutrality, what you're doing is not in the interests or representative of the view of the people of this part of Ireland. And I think given that housing is the single biggest social crisis that we have in this state, I think we can have no better person to succeed Michael D than Catherine on housing alone. And that's before we talk about neutrality, peace, social justice, equality. Relentless, tireless campaigner for the survivors of mother and baby homes and institutional settings. Relentless campaigner for families and people with special needs and disabilities. I mean, the list just goes on. So what I would say to people is this. We have a week. Right? Yep, Catherine's ahead in the polls, but a poll is a snapshot in time and things change. Ask Jim Gavin about that. And therefore, if people want Catherine Connolly as President, go and convince other people that they want Catherine Connolly as President. Every single person here, every single one of you can make sure that come next Saturday, when the ballot boxes are opened and the ballots are counted, Catherine wins this race. Not for Catherine, but for all of the people that we all represent, fight for and advocate for, who need a better Ireland, in particular, better housing in Ireland. And then the final thing to say is that the day after, what are we going to do? Many of us have been involved in a series of attempts to build a mass popular movement for a radical change in housing policy, on the streets, in the councils, in workplaces, in communities, and in the Oireachtas. And it's tough going, folks, because people experiencing housing crisis are very, very weighed down with the weight of what they're experiencing. And getting people to organise and mobilise in the kinds of numbers that are required to put pressure on this government or to make sure that the next government is going to do the right thing is hard work. So let's not just get Catherine elected, but let's use that as the springboard to then build that mass popular movement to build secure, adequate and affordable homes for people. The reason why Fatima Mansions is so relevant to this is because in the 1930s and the 1940s, this country was broke. This country was reeling from a war of independence and a civil war. During that period of time, we had the impacts of the Second World War and all of its implications for Ireland. And yet communities, activists, progressive politicians, and good public servants made a very simple decision, that our grandparents should not live in tenements. Our grandparents should have the dignity to have good quality homes to raise their children and us as their grandchildren. And they made it happen. 17,000 public homes were built in this city in that decade. That's a phenomenal number when you think of the size of Dublin. My grandmother was born in St. Augustine Street in the tenements, but she was able to raise my father across the road in Dolphin Road in Drimnagh. And as a consequence, my father didn't have to worry about cholera. My father didn't have to worry about TB. My father was able to have a better quality of life, and because of that, I and my sisters were able to have a better quality of life as well. And that means housing isn't just about a roof over your head. It's so essential to our flourishing and our ability as individuals, families, and communities to thrive. So if that vision excites you, if that's what you would like to see for the future of housing in our city, in our country, then from today to Friday, do every single thing you can. Talk to every single person you can to make sure they make the effort to go to the polling station, put that number 1 beside Catherine Connolly's name, and ensure she is the next Uachtarán na hÉireann. No better person is qualified. Let's make it happen, but it's up to all of us. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for taking us home there. I do realise that I have gotten us all here today when we could be out canvassing, and many of our colleagues in the constituency couldn't make it because they're knocking on doors precisely in those areas that you mentioned, Dolphin House, around this surrounding area. And I think it's worth noting 2 things. One, I can't imagine any other campaign doing the depth and breadth of door knocking and canvassing that the Connolly campaigners have put in areas that Heather Humphreys will not go near. And secondly, I think this is, Connolly is the only candidate where you could have even broached having this kind of topic or this discussion around, or even, potential candidates when there are many names in the race. And I think for all of those reasons, it really behooves us to get out and get her elected for the next week. We have some time left though, so if anyone would like to make a contribution or question from the floor, Tommy,
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Yep.
No one wants to talk about housing. Maybe while others formulate their questions on the particular topics which have been discussed at the moment, but I was just thinking if, and hopefully the news cycle will change in a different way, but if it comes back to who was and who wasn't invited into Leinster House, might we please quite remember that Brian Mast was invited and celebrated on the 25th of May. He advocated not just for the genocide, he was a veteran of the IDF. He's actually advocating for stripping US citizens of their citizenship currently. That's a massive subject, and we need to use opportunities like this. If that topic's brought up again, look at who Simon Harris and ask Heather how she feels about having a man who's threatening Americans with stripping them of their citizenship if they do not agree with his donors. I mean, I think it's an opportunity for us, maybe to us, to respond in kind whenever we get the chance, but that's just a thought I had in general.
Okay, anyone else?
Is that a hand over there, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Hi. First of all, can I thank you all for your inspiring contributions, all of you, really wonderful from different perspectives. So I live in the area. I'm a member of CATU, paid up member. I'm also housing. I own my own house, but I really think the work you do is great. So I'm a member. I don't do anything, but a few thoughts. I mean, I teach architecture in TU Dublin, and it just really bothers me that one of the best cities in the world, it's in Europe, it has the highest happiness rate, every year almost. And 70% of the housing there is public housing. Some of you will know where I'm talking about, it's Vienna. And it is a remarkable model, and we should all look at it, and we should push our government to look at it. And I know Dublin City Council have tried. They had a big exhibition here at one point, pre-COVID and stuff. So that's one thing I just wanted to say, just to remind people that they're like some other countries do it really well, and there's no reason why we can't. And then that it's not anti-constitutional to advocate for public housing, like some people claim, because of the rights to property at all. There is also the right to kind of the public good. So that was one thought that came into my head as you're all talking. I have a question about the Airbnb thing, because it does seem to be a big problem, and it's one of these things that perhaps all of us use in some way. I mean, I have to put my hand up. I've used Airbnb. I try to get if I even on the island here, if I go to Cork or Belfast, I look for a hotel. It's €250 for a night. I go to Airbnb. There's so much more range, and I can get a bed for the night, right, in someone's house, and they can maybe meet a nice family, you know. So, and I think a lot of us have that dilemma, you know. So I don't expect you to have the solution here, but how do we deal with that? Like, I agree that Airbnb, we should always point out Airbnb should not be allowed to be in the West Bank, for example, but how do we deal with it here? How do you stop people using it, for example? Should we kick Airbnb out of Ireland, given that the problem there that they employ some Irish people, you know? And so that's all. There's a bit of a dilemma there, and maybe I just wonder, have you? But your stats, Rosie, that you gave were incredible for what's happening in the Gaeltacht. Shocking, absolutely shocking, and it's the same in other places as well. So thanks.
If we have maybe like one or two more other questions, then we can take a batch and a go.
In terms of Airbnb, I'm not going to rob Roisin's statistics. I'm not even going to speak about the Gaeltacht. I understand exactly where she's coming from. But if people in this community walk through some of the streets here, and you will see the key box. And in fairness to Dublin City Council, recently they just took down a lot of the boxes. Just that's the frustration. Some of it, and some of the use of Airbnb in this city is because of the homeless crisis. So the hostels are all full. The cheap hotels are all full. And you see the same effect in other cities where there is a homelessness crisis, or where students are living in hostels or wherever, rather than appropriate student accommodation. So it's all linked in the city. In the Gaeltacht, it's a different problem because that's linked through the holiday homes and all of that as well, so that there isn't accommodation available. But we need the powers to be given to the local authorities for them to be able to address it. We need the funding to be given to the local authority so that they can build what they've promised us, but then they get a logjam from the department. But tonight and this campaign, I think Roisin's correct. It gives hope that for once, if you want, all of the progressive forces are starting to align well ahead of general elections. There has been campaigns before in advance of elections, but they've been a bit far out. We haven't worked as well together. We haven't transferred to each other in this same form. So I think whatever comes of this, Catherine Connolly will be elected, but whatever comes of this unity is what I'm talking about. Is that we have a duty, I believe, to continue working together, not only on this issue, but on all of the issues that we agree on. Just a little bit divides us all, but that shouldn't be the core. The forces that have been in government in this state are the ones who have caused the problem. Unless they're gone, unless their paymasters are gone, then we're not going to address the fundamental issues, which is we're not going to ever have a housing crisis declared or a housing emergency declared, similar to what we had with COVID. If you declare an emergency, then you start dealing with it day in, day out, until it's addressed. It's not been approached in that way because they don't want it approached in that way, because that would undermine their profits.
Okay, I might let our speakers come in and respond to any of those that they felt appropriate. The Airbnb one maybe for you, Roisin. $1 million question.
Yeah, and I'm sure Owen will be able to come in on that as well. But firstly, yeah, to the comments that you made about, I think one of the biggest issues around Airbnb for all of us is the convenience of it, and because it's become so obvious and in your face that you almost forget that there are and I know there absolutely is the issue of it's so expensive to stay in a hotel in Cork or in Galway or in any of the kind of bigger cities in Ireland. But there are still actually traditional B&Bs out there as well. Many of them now have resorted to advertising on Airbnb because people, that's where they get more of their traffic from. But you can, like old style, still pick up a phone and, you know, and ring a B&B as well. Again, going back to that point of the Airbnb and it being a room in someone's house, generally those Airbnbs are businesses that are actually functioning as B&Bs properly commercially and are registered as such. And the majority, from if I remember from my notes, it's 67% nationally in Ireland of our Airbnbs are entire homes. So that's only, about 30% of them are private rooms, which is what Airbnb was actually established to be, was someone letting out, a spare room in their house. So it's become this monster out of what, and when it was first established, it was quite useful. But what it has become has strayed so far from, what it was supposed to be. And it absolutely is a challenge, I think, for us to challenge that, but it's something that we do have to challenge, similarly to any of the other, BDS targets or boycotting targets. It's not necessarily always the easiest option, but it's kind of maybe a moral question that you have, do you have to ask yourself. I have used Airbnb in the past. It wasn't until the last couple of years that I even thought of the kind of the social and the community impact of it, because again, you just think, I'm going on my holidays, I'll use Airbnb. But I spent time in the West Bank 3 or 4 years ago, and coming back from that and then working in this, with the Gaeltacht communities and seeing even that link and what everyone else has been mentioning as well, that it's all connected. And I just think, that we need to take that responsibility, I think, to kind of to seek out alternatives. And the question of what do we do, or should we get rid of Airbnb in Ireland, and how do we push it out? There are supposed to be regulations on Airbnb in Ireland, but the issue, they are there, but the issue is that they're not being enforced. Like when the rent pressure zones were introduced in 2019, and again, I can be fact-checked here if I want in a minute maybe, but these restrictions were imposed, and people who are operating Airbnbs are legally required to register them as such, but the problem is that it's not happening. So I know in Galway, for example, in Galway City, only 4% of Airbnbs are legally registered, and these are people who are operating commercial businesses, which means there also are no standard, there are no standards being applied, and there's an EU. There was an EU regulation passed last year, as far as I know, that's now being kind of transposed into Irish law, that will result in this registration, a kind of registry of short-term letting. So that won't just be Airbnb, but Airbnb and Booking.com, for example, as well, another crowd to be boycotting. But this is supposed to be brought into Ireland by, I think it's May 2026. But a lot of the discussion around that in the last year or so, there's being a kind of a 15,000 population cap to be put on it, if I'm correct, and if that's still to be happening. So it should, if done properly, have a great impact in Dublin, for example, or in these in more kind of urban or densely populated communities where people who are applying for that planning permission to have an Airbnb will be denied. But there is not a single Gaeltacht community in the country that has a population of 15,000. So a lot, or not even the Gaeltacht, but any of the kind of more Western, like County Clare, for example, is absolutely crippled by Airbnb. And they won't hit those thresholds either. So what we need, and it's been done, again, it's not reinventing the wheel. New York, British Columbia have really good examples of what's called a primary residence requirement. And essentially it's going back to what Airbnb was supposed to be, that thing of you primarily reside in your home and you're renting out a room. It's not, it's marketed as a ban on Airbnb by the Airbnb lobby, but it's a primary residence requirement, and if we had that in Ireland, it would go a huge way, I think, to rectifying some of the damage that's been done.
Yeah, so just two things. So first of all, short-term letting isn't the problem. Right? It's unregulated short-term letting. And actually, the regulations that Owen Murphy introduced in 2019 are, certainly for urban areas, very good in principle, because they set up a very simple idea. If you own a home and you want to either rent out a room in that home or the entire home for less than 90 nights in a year, but it's your primary residence, then that's fine, because that has no impact on the housing system or the rental market, and it's what they call peer-to-peer home sharing, right? So in rural Ireland, for example, you'll have in particular tourism hotspots, some families, particularly lower income families, will actually leave their family home for the 2 months, July and August, move in with extended family and just rent out their own family home for those 2 months, and they make additional income. That is not in any way a problem in urban or rural Ireland. The difficulty with the Owen Murphy regulations was there was no legally effective way to enforce them. We rowed with Owen at the time to say the regs are fine for urban Ireland, but the enforcement is non-existent. And in fairness, Dublin City Council and Cork City Council made a very valiant effort to enforce them. They just couldn't, right? So the solution is pretty straightforward, right, which is as follows. The first is the register has to be produced, exactly like the B&B register. The legislation is going through the Oireachtas at the moment. And that means anybody who wants to short-term let, whether their own home or a commercial property, will have to register. And if they don't, they can be fined €5,000 or get 6 months in jail. It works for B&Bs, let's do it for short-term lets. The second thing is the overwhelming majority of short-term lets today are breaking the law. They do not have planning permission for what they're doing. In some cases, people don't even understand that or know that. And the register would then mean you don't get on the register unless you're able to demonstrate you have planning permission. And that means in the very high demand rental areas, nobody is able to commercially short-term let a building. You can do it for your own property for 90 nights a year or less, but you can't have a whole property that's out. It can either be in the long-term rental market or whatever. And in those tourism areas, I think the challenge here is, because some of those areas do rely on tourism to sustain the local economy, what you do is you do exactly what we do with B&Bs, which is they have to get the planning permission, and the local authority is empowered to say, this is the appropriate level of commercial short-term letting, and that might be none, it might be some, or in some areas it might be a little bit more, but it's guided by what is in the interest of the rental and the tourism economy. It's pretty straightforward, right? The government were delayed by the European Commission for 2 years to get the register. We're finally getting it. And then on top of that, what you would do is something equally simple. We tabled legislation in the last government, the last Dáil, and the government didn't oppose it but never introduced it. Every day, Airbnb and the other platforms are advertising illegal short-term lets. They're facilitating widespread law breaking. So it's really simple. If you park your car somewhere where you're not meant to, what happens? You get an administrative fine. It's called a parking ticket. Every night that Airbnb advertises a property that is not planning compliant, they should get a fine. It's very simple. The local authority doesn't have to go to court, doesn't have to waste time with lawyers. They just slap that administrative fine. And that fine is equal to and more than Airbnb's fee for the rental. That would just clean it up overnight. So it's not that people don't know how to fix this problem, right? There's a lack of political will. But that's how you do it. Let people peer share. That's no problem, and regulate the industry. And then the only other thing I wanted to say is you're right about Vienna, right? And I don't dispute that. But we don't have to go any further than within the canals of our city for the same model. Fairbrothers Fields, Black Pits, that was cost rental before Vienna even knew what cost rental was. Marino in the 20s, Cumann Gale, that was cost rental before Vienna knew what cost rental was. Crumlin, the largest public housing estate in Europe, 6,000 homes. Do you know what those homes are selling for at the moment? €500,000. Why? Because they are brilliantly built, albeit with poured concrete. They have generous back gardens. They're close to the city, and now they have good amenities. Those houses are going to last for another 100 years. So yes, we need to learn from other countries, and other countries have done wonderful things, but let's not forget there were moments in our own history, not because governments wanted to do it, because governments were invariably forced to do it, where we built really good quality public homes for a broad range of working people, right? Cantfort, I'm just naming the ones in this constituency. Anybody know Cantfort? Okay, the car parking is a nightmare if you live up there at the moment, right? But they're beautiful homes. And therefore I think what we need to realize is actually we were able to do this before when we were broke and we hadn't the experience. And therefore, with all the surpluses we have and all the experience, let's do it now, right? And even these, right? I didn't see that earlier, apologies, right? But I'm going to tell this very short story. So I've been doing this big research project around the inner city flats. And I interviewed this incredible woman, Kathleen Delamere. Kathleen was 96 when I interviewed her in December 2022. She passed away the following year. She lived her entire 97 years on the one street, Townsend Street, down off Pearse Street. Tenements, 5 stories, 10 families, family to a room, 1 outdoor toilet. Right? As the Townsend Street flats, what we now know as Markievicz flats, were being built, her family got the first allocation. She moved in with her mum and dad. She got married to Billy, a labourer who died some years earlier, and she moved back into the tenements. And when the second block was built, she moved into her first flat. And I remember asking her, do you remember the day you moved in? And like a lot of older people, her current memory isn't necessarily great, but her historic memory is sharp as a razor. And her eyes lit up. Right? And she said, oh, Owen, she said, it was luxury. We had an indoor toilet, an indoor bathroom. We had a bedroom of our own. We had hot and cold water. Right? Now, Markievicz Flats has been a tough place to live. Let's not be naive about this. Right? That flat complex went through really, really tough times. Right? But on her 96th year, living on her own on the ground floor, having gone through COVID and COVID bingo and all of that, the last question I asked her was, if you had a choice, would you live anywhere else? Right? And again, she leaned over and she said, oh, and she said, if I won the lottery tomorrow, she says, I wouldn't go anywhere else. Because what that public housing did was gave her good quality housing, a vibrant community, and in the toughest of times, when COVID was really biting, that woman didn't have to want for anything. She was telling me she could just go out and the young fellas would go and get her shopping, or they'd bring in the messages, and therefore let's remember the stuff we've done well ourselves, and let's just do more of it. That's not against Vienna. Vienna's really interesting, but you only have to go down around the corner to see exactly the same thing. And it's a little bit easier to convince people to do stuff we've already done than to import something, albeit very valuable, from somewhere else.
Bernard? Oh, do you want to come in? Yeah.
Thanks so much. I know we all have to get home, and particularly I have 8 voters for Catherine Connolly here tonight, the youngest being about 5. So just to say that, well done for being patient. But yeah, so I just want to kind of add, you know, when we're talking about just as we're talking about housing, and I actually went to school at Townsend Street, not too far away from here. Different circumstances, because it was the only school for travellers. I used to travel from Finglas into Dublin. It was an all traveller school, and people might recall that they had segregation. So we weren't really worthy of going to mainstream schooling. But so, you know, and that was always a challenge. So in Ireland we did have, and when I was talking about institutionalised racism, I was actually talking about institutionalised systems that really managed travellers and the issues. But at the same time, things like evictions in Dublin City Council were absolutely all the time. It was constant. It was a constant issue for travellers, and still remains an issue even today. And I know it's very prevalent. But I just want to add, for travellers, it's a basic fundamental right. So we're still fighting. And Owen talked about talking to that 91-year-old about, you know, the luxury of having water, the luxury of having hot and cold water, having a toilet. We're still fighting for that. That's a basic fundamental human right. And where we're arguing is that nobody in society, including our community, should go without actually having a shower, having hot water, having cold, having sanitation. And that is still the fight that we have. It's a long battle, and it's not a luxury, it's a basic human right. And I think that, you know, given that Kathleen Connolly's campaign, and I think myself and Linda have been watching that, and have been watching how humble, and you know, actually don't know Catherine Connolly that well, and I know Owen, you know her extremely well, but I have had the fortune of meeting President Mary Robson. I've met all the different presidents at different times, including our current president, Michael D. Higgins, and I'm very humbled to see that we have a good history of strong, you know, candidates with real central around base, you know, in terms of humanity and what that means, whether a local level, whether it's a national level, or whether it's international. And Catherine Connolly had been out in Ballyfermot only recently in terms of Library Park, you know. And I always say, if you want people to vote and you want to go out, well, actually show leadership. Go out to the people, talk to them, and tell them why it's important to go out and vote, in order to, and not just leave it, because people can feel apathy, they can feel lack of confidence, and in this case, I think Catherine Connolly has done, has shown leadership by just being humble, shown leadership just by, explaining the importance of giving people an opportunity who've left prison, showing how much importance it is that we can, we can move and we can support and we can actually work with people who are the most excluded in society and have opportunities. But I do think that's important, and I'm also being realistic. Catherine Connolly is not going to change housing tomorrow, being elected. I know that. I think we all know that. But I think what we can do is ensure that we have somebody who will be vocal, will be supportive, but also that we can build, as you said, and have a movement for going forward. And I think, there are movements. But I think for all communities, whether Gaelic, whether it's travellers, whether it's migrants, people in international protection, whether it's women, and we need to ensure that nobody is left behind. Those flats that we're looking at, there's actually travellers living in those flats, and I remember having relatives in some of those areas. And we have some of the strongest relationships yet with some of the most deprived working class areas in Ireland, and that includes, Ringsend, where I actually lived in Ringsend, across in the flats. But at the same time, there's a strong connection. One of the first sites is actually not too far away from here. It's actually beside Guinness's, and there was a number of families, and there's one in Ringsend as well. But the one in Ringsend was actually closed. It was like, the walls were something like 20 foot surrounding the site, and it did feel like it was more like a prison, just in terms of how people were so removed. But in saying that, that's my, I just want to conclude with that and saying it was actually, housing is a fundamental right. It's a basic right, and that some communities are still struggling, still fighting, and we do need, to ensure that we're all working together, and that by working together, we're not working against one another. And we need unity, solidarity, and support. And whatever happens locally can happen regionally, can happen nationally. And let's hope that, that people go out and vote in a week's time for the president that we want, which is Catherine Connolly.
Okay. And I think that takes us to time. So thank you once again to all of our amazing speakers. I hope everybody's leaving as inspired and revved up as I am after this. So look, I think it's been said already. I'm not going to belabor the point. We've got a week to go, right? We've got a week to put someone in the Áras who understands housing as a right, who understands the nuances that all communities on this island are facing and how to address them, and who can serve as a beacon for building movements going forward. We've got 8 days. We need to, as Bernard said, like Catherine's showing leadership, I think it's time for every single person in this room to show leadership. Get out and talk to your coworkers, get out and talk to your friends, get out and knock on doors. And yeah, let's do this. There's a bunch of materials down the back. People are very encouraged to take. We've got window posters, if you live somewhere that has a lot of thoroughfare. And we've got tons of leaflets, badges, stickers. Particularly if you're living in an apartment block or flats that are hard to access, take some leaflets and please do your own block, because this is a real difficulty when it comes to canvassing. But anyway, just take as much stuff as you want and get it out there over the next week or so. And yeah, I think the polls are encouraging, but we need to turn up and make sure that this actually happens. So let's get out and elect Catherine Connolly.